December 2025 is going to mark the 250th anniversary of the birth of Jane Austen, and it is a truth universally acknowledged that this is going to lead to a ton of low-effort, things you didn't know videos. But how can you trust them? Are the facts from her life? Well, this is going to be a misconception show with a difference. Instead of going in and debunking misconceptions, though there is going to be some of that, we're going to really try to delve deep into the story behind the fact to see how it holds up to scrutiny. And, well, might as well start with the start. As soon as you hear the phrase, "it's a truth universally acknowledged," you know you're going to hear an Austen quote. Except it's not original to her. According to Oxford professor Freya Johnston, there is an especially dense cluster of truths being universally acknowledged in publications of the 1780s and 90s, the years of Austen's apprenticeship as an author. Going by the deployment in print of such phrasing, it is a truth universally acknowledged might be the opening of a sermon about human fallibility, or a satirical tract in the Swiftian vein, or of a sweeping historical survey or schoolroom textbook, even of a political argument about, say, the rights and wrongs of democracy, or of a speech concerning the legitimacy of an administration. The point is that the first half of one of the most famous sentences in English is a perfectly standard late 18th, early 19th century stock phrase. But that's just the first half. The second half is probably also a literary allusion. If you think of Samuel Johnson et al. Today, it's due to his dictionary or maybe an early 2010s meme. But honestly, we don't even think of his dictionary that often, and probably nobody using the meme realizes who the guy was. Which is a shame, because for a long time, Johnson was a big deal. Much has been made of how he influenced Austen, with randomly C.S. Lewis commenting that Austen is the daughter of Dr. Johnson. She inherits his common sense, his morality, even much of his style. That sentiment is perhaps debatable, but Austen herself seems to have praised Johnson as the first of men, and his influence is usually seen as pretty explicit in the opening lines, plural, of Pride and Prejudice. In a 1751 work, Samuel Johnson has a character say, "I was known to possess a fortune and to want a wife." Compare with Austen's, "a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." That's not all. There seems to be a response to Johnson in the second sentence of Pride and Prejudice. Johnson's character, and that's the character, continues that due to his fortune and want of wife, women are descending on him. In the second sentence of Pride and Prejudice, Austen changes that to it being the families who are pushing their daughters onto the man with the fortune. In his Reading Samuel Johnson, Reception and Representation, 1750 to 1970, Phil Jones comments that the truth universally acknowledged is propagated not by the vulturous females of Johnson's character's imagination, but issues from the mind of the surrounding families in Austen's rural middle-class England. All this is happening in the first, now, 2 sentences. An audience in Austen's time would get the truth universally acknowledged intro as standard flourish. They also might get the continuation as a flipping reference to Samuel Johnson. Modern readers have lost both of those references, so Jane Austen stands alone. While we're at it, let's talk about Pride and Prejudice itself. It's widely said that Pride and Prejudice was rejected by publishers when it was first submitted, and maybe. Let's just steal a quick fact from some website. In November 1797, Austen's father sent a charming letter to Thomas Cadell of the London publisher Cadell and Davies, offering an early version of Pride and Prejudice. Cadell turned it down, sight unseen. That's the traditional story, but in her paper, A Tentative Jane Austen Query, Janet Todd argued that maybe the rejected manuscript was actually in early Sense and Sensibility. Let's look at the direct evidence for both sides. And I think I've summed it all up. Seriously. One guess, decades later, by a family member. And it was a guess. He writes, "The work thus summarily rejected must have been Pride and Prejudice." Not was, must have been. A little earlier, even his own sister is more hesitant, saying, "I do not know which novel he would have sent." But that's just the direct evidence. The point of Todd's article is that the indirect evidence doesn't preclude it being Sense and Sensibility either. Okay, taking a bunch of steps back, here's what we know. On November 1st, 1797, Austen's father George sent a letter to a publisher named Thomas Cadell, saying in part, "I have in my possession a manuscript novel comprising 3 volumes about the length of Miss Burney's Evelina." The first clue is the reference to Frances Burney's Evelina. It's been pointed out by several biographers independent of this debate that Burney's book was nearly 20 years old at the time and was considered out of date. It's also published by a different company and has no relation to Cadell. This is doubly odd because Burney had recently published a successful book with Cadell, which would seem the more likely book to bring up. Now, you might legitimately point out some things. Burney's new book was 5 volumes rather than our mystery manuscript's 3, so the about the length line wouldn't work. You could also reasonably point out that Evelina was a debut novel, so maybe Austen's father thought this was a better point of comparison for the novel he was submitting. But while both are good points, neither helps with the identification either way, so some scholars who have hoped for extra clues have posited that George Austen picked Evelina because he was submitting an epistolary novel, and Evelina was also an epistolary novel. Quick refresher, epistolary is, according to the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms, a novel written in the form of a series of letters exchanged among the characters of the story, with extracts from their journals sometimes included. Except it's Sense and Sensibility that we're told started life as an epistolary novel. Austen's niece Caroline commented, "Memory is treacherous, but I cannot be mistaken in saying that Sense and Sensibility was first written in letters," which no one doubts that means epistolary. So, if Austen's father was making a reference to the epistolary format of Evelina and comparing it to this new work by his daughter, and if Austen's niece is remembering correctly, that would be a hint that it really was in early Sense and Sensibility. The first supposition is a dead end, but the second one is worth examining. A few experts have long argued that there are problems with Caroline's story. For instance, if Sense and Sensibility was originally letters between characters, who are the letters being sent between? The main characters, Eleanor and Marianne, are together for the bulk of the book, and there aren't obvious third parties that they'd be writing to. Compare that to Pride and Prejudice, where the characters are often separated and it makes sense for them to be writing letters. And Caroline was around 12 when Jane Austen died, and only 6 when Sense and Sensibility was published, so she's probably not remembering the early form of Sense and Sensibility firsthand. She's almost certainly relaying things her family told her, which makes her less eyewitness testimony and more hearsay testimony. Todd's article counters that Sense and Sensibility has some awkwardness to it that Pride and Prejudice lacks, which is sometimes attributed to trying to convert the epistolary format to a narrative format. Like when you write an essay and then have to do a rewrite but don't want to scrap your previous work, there are always those little bumps that don't quite work. Carolyn also just said that Sense and Sensibility was first written in letters. That doesn't mean Pride and Prejudice necessarily wasn't. So again, the evidence is annoyingly useless in the question of what was sent to the publishers. Okay, how about length? George Austen did say it was about the length of Evelina, so surely that's a clue. Well, no. We know Pride and Prejudice was heavily shortened. Austen herself described how she lopped and cropped it, and we also know Sense and Sensibility was heavily reworked. According to the Cambridge Companion to Pride and Prejudice, both Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility are around the 120,000 word mark, while Evelina is 155,000 words. Another dead end. Is there anything else? Yes! We have another piece of evidence which is, spoiler alert, completely useless. Austen's sister Cassandra probably wrote a note that said, "First impressions begun in October 1796. Finished in August 1797, published afterwards, with alterations and contractions, under the title of Pride and Prejudice. Sense and Sensibility begun November 1797. I am sure that something of the same story and characters had been written earlier and called Eleanor and Marianne." Then she says more stuff we don't care about. Remember, our hard date is November 1797. That's when George Austen sends in whatever he sends in. Most people read that note and think, well, right, she finished what would become Pride and Prejudice in August, and then a couple months later her dad sends it off. Timelines fit. But we're also told that Eleanor and Marianne had been written at some point earlier, and then Austen started revising it in November 1797. Todd asks the perfectly reasonable question whether the revision was in response to the refusal. At the same time, we're told in early Pride and Prejudice existed in time to be sent off, so that doesn't prove one thing or the other. Indeed, none of the evidence is super strong or even slightly unambiguous, so left at the same place we started. Austen's niece didn't know. Then Austen's nephew guessed it must have been Pride and Prejudice. Then that fact morphed from a best guess to being presented in basically every Jane Austen everything without any form of hedging. Because saying Pride and Prejudice was rejected is a better soundbite than one of her books, later assumed to be Pride and Prejudice, was rejected. And finally, what would a video or an article or anything be without an image of Jane Austen? I'm sure many of the 250th anniversary videos are going to be accompanied by pictures like this, or this, or this, and they're all weak. Especially this one, which is among the most popular images of Jane Austen. Slight problem with it, one of the most famously unmarried authors ever has a wedding ring. For some reason, the 19th century creator of this image decided she needed a ring. We have one pretty definite image of Jane Austen from 1804, made by her sister Cassandra. Sadly, it doesn't show Austen's face, just her back. We know this is on the definite side because Austen's niece Anna Lefroy mentioned the existence of a sketch which Aunt Cassandra made of her on one of their expeditions, sitting down out of doors on a hot day with her bonnet strings untied. Sadly, that picture, well, it would probably work quite well on a book cover. But for centuries, Austen fans have wanted to see her face. Thankfully, there's also a pretty uncontroversial portrait that is a face. You can find people who seem to have doubts, but they're private doubts. Those doubts exist basically entirely because in the 1830s, Austen's work is being republished, and it seems her family mentions the existence of a sketch out there that the publisher can use. Except one of Austen's brothers will write to said publisher, "On further inquiry and inspection, I find that it was merely the figure and attitude. The countenance was concealed by a veil, nor was there any resemblance of features intended. It was a study." Best guess is that he's talking about the 1804 drawing of her back and just describes it poorly. So if the face drawing really is of Austen, why not offer that up? There are explanations, like maybe Cassandra didn't think it was good enough, but it's a fair question, especially since unlike the back portrait, we don't have any hard evidence that it is actually Austen. According to Margaret Kirkham, it becomes identified with Jane because Cassandra Austen seems to have given it to Cassie Aston Austen, and several living relatives felt it looked like Jane. Mostly. Anna Lefroy is quoted as saying it was hideously unlike Austen, but at least she doesn't deny that it is her. So those are the depictions that pretty much everyone accepts as genuine. How about the ones that are actually used? Well, when her nephew J.E. Austen Leigh was working on his memoir, the one that told us the rejection anecdote, he grabbed Cassandra's sketch and handed it over to a man named James Andrews to improve upon it. The arms are uncrossed, the gaze is changed, the chair is changed, and Austen is made more Victorian. That image is then engraved for the book. And it's not Austen. Austen's niece Caroline commented, "There is a look which I recognize as hers," and other stuff you can see on screen. And Cassie Aston Austen agreed, commenting that it is a very pleasing sweet face, though I confess to not thinking it much like the original. So that's this portrait. Then for the book Portrait Gallery of Eminent Men and Women of Europe and America, they take the Andrews image and make some tweaks, including adding the infamous wedding ring. So this portrait, which is widely used even today, it's basically the 19th century equivalent of putting a filter on a filter. And it's a filter on a filter of an image which is already only probably Jane Austen. Obviously, this lack of pictures has led to a whole industry of people discovering new portraits of Jane Austen. But there's some candidates that are considered more promising than others. Chief among them is the Rice portrait, which purports to show a young Jane. It would take a full documentary to do the entire story justice, so suffice to say proponents of the portrait argue that the provenance, the family stories, that in the late 19th century it was thought to be Austen, that kind of thing supports that it is a portrait of Jane Austen. The other side argues that the facts that are external to the family, the clothes the person's wearing, a stamp that's on the back, suggest it was painted first decade 19th century. when Austen would have been too old to be the person depicted. Both sides have their argument against the other's arguments, which is why it would take a full documentary to do this properly. But if you see any image of Austen other than this, and let's be fair, probably this, without any form of clarification, know they're putting aesthetic choices above historical facts. I hope one thread has made itself clear throughout all of these facts. If somebody says an early version of Pride and Prejudice was rejected, they're not necessarily wrong, but they're not necessarily right either. Same if they show a picture of the Rice portrait as an image of Jane Austen. It could be, but could be is not the same as is. And if you see somebody start an Austen allusion with, "It's a truth universally acknowledged," know that it's just a period flourish. We've just lost the reference.